NATO had calculated that Russia would retreat after the devastating losses in Ukraine. However, the Kremlin's latest provocation in the Baltic Sea has triggered a response so overwhelming that military analysts are calling it the most significant alliance mobilization since the Cold War. On March 12, 2026, Russian naval vessels deliberately violated Swedish territorial waters in a coordinated operation involving 17 warships, 6 submarines, and what intelligence reports describe as aggressive electronic warfare jamming that disabled civilian GPS systems across the entire Stockholm archipelago. This was not a navigational error or routine patrol. This was a calculated test of NATO's newest members, and the alliance's answer came with such devastating speed and precision that the Kremlin is now facing a strategic nightmare it never anticipated. The images you are about to see on your screens reveal the most dramatic naval standoff in European waters in decades. What you see is not just ships passing in the night. The footage shows a meticulously coordinated NATO response involving over 40 surface vessels, 12 submarines from 5 different nations, and a level of technological superiority that has left Russian commanders scrambling to save face. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are 3 main factors that transform this incident from a Russian provocation into a catastrophic miscalculation. The first is Sweden's immediate activation of its coastal defense systems, weapons that have been upgraded specifically to counter Russian aggression. The second is the unprecedented speed with which NATO deployed its rapid reaction forces, arriving in the Baltic within 48 hours. The third factor, which we will explain in the later parts of this video, involves a technological capability that Russia did not know NATO possessed in these waters. Now let us descend to that first moment when Russian Admiral Konstantin Petrov made his fatal decision to cross into Swedish territorial waters near Gotland Island. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, the operation began at approximately 0300 hours local time on March the 12th. The Russian Northern Fleet's flagship, the nuclear-powered battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky, led a formation that included 3 Udaloy-class destroyers, 6 Steregushchi-class corvettes, and support vessels carrying what Defense Ministry sources estimate to be over 200 cruise missiles. Satellite imagery confirmed by NATO intelligence shows the fleet moving in a deliberate southward trajectory, crossing the maritime boundary precisely 17 nautical miles east of Gotland. Swedish coastal radar stations detected the incursion within 90 seconds. The response that followed would rewrite the rulebook on alliance coordination. The Swedish Armed Forces activated Protocol Norsken, a classified coastal defense system that had been tested but never deployed in actual confrontation. These are not your grandfather's coastal artillery batteries. The system employs land-based RBS-15 Mark IV anti-ship missiles with ranges exceeding 300 kilometers, upgraded guidance systems resistant to electronic warfare, and targeting capabilities that can track up to 60 simultaneous threats. Each missile carries a 440-pound high-explosive warhead, specifically designed to penetrate modern naval armor. Within 6 minutes of the Russian incursion, 12 launch sites along the Gotland coast went to full operational status. Swedish Air Force, JS-39. Gripen fighters, armed with RBS-15F air-launched variants, scrambled from 3 bases, achieving airborne status in under 4 minutes. The message was unmistakable: turn back or face engagement. But Russia did not turn back. Admiral Petrov, according to intercepted communications analyzed by German intelligence, believed NATO would hesitate. He calculated that the alliance's newest members, Sweden and Finland, would not risk escalation without explicit authorization from Washington, Brussels, and other NATO capitals. This assessment proved to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in recent Russian military history. What Petrov did not understand is that NATO's command structure had been fundamentally reorganized following the invasion of Ukraine. The alliance had pre-authorized defensive protocols that allowed frontline members to respond to territorial violations with immediate force, subject only to rapid post-action notification rather than prior approval. Sweden did not need to wait for permission. Stockholm already had it. The Swedish response triggered Article 4 consultations, but NATO members were simultaneously activating forces before the diplomatic process even began. The United States deployed the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group from its position in the North Sea, covering the 600 nautical miles to the Baltic approaches in 36 hours. The carrier brought with it a full complement of FA-18 Super Hornets, E-2D Advanced Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system. German naval forces surged from Kiel, deploying 3 Brandenburg-class frigates and 2 Type 220A submarines, vessels designed specifically for Baltic operations with air-independent propulsion systems that make them nearly impossible to detect. Polish forces activated their newly acquired Arleigh Burke-class destroyer ORP Wisła and mobilized coastal missile batteries armed with naval strike missiles purchased from Norway. Denmark closed the straits. Finland moved its coastal defense forces to maximum readiness along its 850-mile border with Russia. Within 72 hours of the initial Russian incursion, NATO had assembled a naval force in the Baltic Sea that outnumbered and outgunned the Russian presence by a factor of 3 to 1. The alliance deployed 42 major surface combatants, 12 submarines, over 130 combat aircraft, and integrated coastal defense systems, creating what military analysts describe as a steel ring around the entire Russian Baltic fleet. But numbers alone do not capture the qualitative advantage. NATO forces brought integrated command and control systems linking Swedish, Finnish, American, German, Polish, Danish, and Norwegian units into a single operational network. The alliance demonstrated real-time data sharing that allowed a Polish frigate to target Russian vessels using targeting data from a Swedish Gripen, which was itself receiving cueing from an American E-2D Hawkeye operating 200 miles away. This brings us to the truly devastating technological revelation. NATO unveiled for the first time in operational deployment a distributed maritime surveillance system that had been secretly installed across the Baltic seabed over the previous 18 months. According to leaked intelligence assessments, the system employs over 300 autonomous underwater sensor nodes manufactured by Norwegian defense contractor Kongsberg, connected by fiber optic cables to processing centers in Stockholm, Helsinki, Warsaw, and Kiel. The network creates a comprehensive acoustic picture of the entire Baltic Sea, tracking every submarine, surface vessel, and even underwater drone with precision that renders traditional submarine stealth tactics obsolete. When Russian submarines attempted to maneuver covertly during the standoff, NATO commanders could track their movements in real time with position accuracy measured in meters rather than kilometers. Russian naval officers monitoring NATO communications realized with horror that their submarine positions were being called out over encrypted channels before their own vessels had even completed their maneuvers. The strategic implications of this confrontation extend far beyond a single naval incident. Russia's Baltic fleet, once considered a credible deterrent force, now finds itself operating in waters where it possesses no tactical advantage whatsoever. The fleet's home port at Kaliningrad is effectively surrounded. To the west, Polish and German forces control the approaches through the Danish Straits. To the north, Swedish and Finnish forces dominate the northern Baltic. To the east, Finland's newly activated coastal defenses create a defensive barrier extending the length of the Gulf of Finland. Kaliningrad, Russia's most heavily militarized exclave, has transformed from a strategic dagger pointed at Europe into an isolated fortress with no secure maritime connection to the Russian mainland. NATO's response has fundamentally altered the regional balance of power in ways that cascade beyond military considerations. With the accession of Finland and Sweden, the Baltic Sea has become what defense analysts now call a NATO lake. Russia controls only the eastern shore, while alliance members encircle the remaining coastline. This geographic reality creates operational nightmares for Russian military planners. Any attempt to reinforce Kaliningrad by sea now requires passage through waters dominated by alliance forces. Air reinforcement requires overflying alliance airspace or taking circuitous routes that increase transit time and vulnerability. Even routine training exercises now occur under the constant surveillance of NATO sensors. The economic implications mirror the military transformation. Russia's Baltic ports, crucial for energy exports and commercial shipping, operate under the implicit threat of blockade in any future conflict. St. Petersburg, Russia's second-largest city and a major economic hub, sits within range of NATO tactical aircraft operating from multiple bases. The psychological impact on Russian strategic planning cannot be overstated. Moscow's leadership, according to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, now faces the reality that the Baltic theater offers no viable offensive options while presenting significant defensive vulnerabilities. The human dimension of this confrontation reveals the changing psychology of both alliance members and Russian military personnel. Swedish naval officers, interviewed anonymously by Radio Free Europe reporters, described a transformation in institutional culture. For decades, Swedish neutrality created a mindset of defensive preparation without expectation of collective action. NATO membership fundamentally altered that psychology. Swedish forces now operate with the confidence that comes from alliance backing, transforming defensive hesitation into proactive deterrence. Finnish officers express similar evolution, describing how generations of defensive planning against Russian invasion have given way to integrated offensive capabilities as part of alliance operations. Russian naval personnel tell a different story. Intercepted communications analyzed by intelligence services reveal demoralization and confusion within Baltic fleet ranks. Sailors and junior officers, forced to operate in waters now completely dominated by NATO sensors and firepower, express privately what they cannot say publicly. Their mission has become impossible. The confident swagger that characterized Russian military communications in the early days of the Ukraine invasion has given way to defensive anxiety and recognition of fundamental disadvantage. Officers who once saw Baltic deployments as prestigious assignments now view them as professional dead ends in a theater where Russia possesses no path to victory. This psychological shift extends to civilian populations in the region. Polish citizens who spent decades under Soviet domination and have watched Russian aggression against Ukraine with existential concern view NATO's overwhelming response as validation of their security choices. Public opinion polling conducted in March 2026 shows 92% approval in Poland for increased defense spending and forward deployment of NATO forces. Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian populations express similar confidence, with anxiety about Russian invasion dropping to its lowest levels since independence. The contrast with Russian border regions is stark. Kaliningrad residents, according to independent Russian polling organizations operating covertly, express growing concern about isolation and economic vulnerability as the exclave becomes increasingly cut off from the mainland. Looking toward the future, this confrontation establishes precedents that will shape European security for decades. NATO has demonstrated that Article 5 collective defense commitments are not merely diplomatic rhetoric, but operational reality backed by overwhelming force. The alliance showed it can mobilize and coordinate forces from multiple nations with speed that matches or exceeds Russian capabilities, destroying the Kremlin's long-standing assumption that democratic deliberation creates exploitable delays. Most significantly, NATO revealed technological capabilities that fundamentally shift Baltic maritime operations in favor of alliance forces. Russia now confronts strategic choices, none of them attractive. The Kremlin can continue provocative actions in the Baltic, accepting that each provocation will trigger overwhelming NATO responses that further demonstrate Russian weakness. Moscow can reduce its Baltic presence, effectively conceding the theater to NATO dominance while freeing resources for other fronts. Or Russia can attempt escalation, perhaps through more aggressive actions that risk actual military confrontation with an alliance that has proven its ability to concentrate superior force with devastating speed. Each option presents its own dangers for a regime that has staked its legitimacy on projecting strength. The coming months will test whether the Kremlin's leadership possesses the strategic flexibility to adapt to new realities or whether pride and propaganda commitments will drive continued provocations in a theater where Russia has already lost. Western intelligence analysts, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggest that hardliners within the Russian security establishment are pushing for escalatory responses to restore deterrence credibility. Moderates argue for de-escalation and focus on theaters where Russia retains advantages. This internal debate will determine whether the Baltic Sea remains a flashpoint or whether Moscow accepts the strategic realignment that NATO membership for Sweden and Finland has created. One element appears certain: NATO's response to the March 12th incursion has established a template for future confrontations. The alliance will not hesitate. It will not deliberate endlessly. It will respond with overwhelming force, technological superiority, and coordination that leaves adversaries with no viable tactical options. This represents a fundamental shift from the alliance's Cold War posture of defensive deterrence to a new model of proactive defense that meets provocations with immediate and devastating response. For Russia, the Baltic Sea has transformed from a strategic asset into a strategic liability. The fleet that Stalin built to project Soviet power now operates as a trapped force in hostile waters. Its every movement tracked, its capabilities negated, its mission reduced to symbolic presence rather than genuine military capability. Admiral Petrov's decision to cross into Swedish waters triggered a cascade of consequences that revealed this uncomfortable truth to Russian leadership, NATO members, and the watching world. Russia challenged NATO in the Baltic. The alliance responded not with words or sanctions or diplomatic protests, but with a display of military power so comprehensive and technologically advanced that it left no doubt about the balance of forces in these waters. Moscow's provocation intended to test alliance resolve instead demonstrated that resolve with such devastating clarity that Russian strategic planners must now completely reassess their assumptions about the Baltic theater. What are your thoughts on NATO's response to Russian provocations in the Baltic Sea? Do you think this overwhelming show of force will deter future Russian aggression or provoke escalation? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. The Baltic Sea standoff that began on March 12, 2026 did not end with naval combat, but with something far more significant: the complete strategic realignment of the regional balance of power. Russia set out to test NATO's newest members. Instead, the Kremlin discovered that the Baltic has become an alliance stronghold where Russian forces operate at permanent disadvantage, tracked by sensors they cannot defeat, outgunned by forces they cannot match, and isolated in waters they can no longer control. Presented by TGN, thank you for choosing us.